The New Statesman.
Hello, I'm Rachel Cunliffe, and on today's New Statesman podcast, I'm talking to Brian Klaas, political scientist at UCL, host of the Power Corrupts podcast, and most relevantly for today, author of the book Corruptible: Who Gets Power and How It Changes Us. Thank you so much for coming in to chat today. Basically, the reason I wanted to talk to you is because about a year ago, you wrote a book that was entirely about why and how we seem to just keep getting the wrong leaders. And I thought it would be quite interesting to discuss that in light of some of the disruption that we've had in UK politics recently. We ended up with a leader who lasted 44 days and managed to make a really already quite bad economic situation even worse. Let's just start off with how you think we got there from a kind of overall, why did we do this to ourselves?
Yeah, I wrote Corruptible because I have never encountered in all my time as a political scientist somebody who says, I think we've got power just about right, and we've got the exact perfect recipe for attracting and promoting the right politicians into high office. No one has ever said that to me. So I think there's a puzzle there about why that is. And Liz Truss is that puzzle, right? Why do we end up with this situation where, without fail in recent years, power has acted like a magnet to people who have no business being in office? And I think the question is so important to discuss because it implies, as I believe, that it's fixable, right? This is not some inevitable thing. Yes, as I argue in the book, power corrupts, and there are effects that power does to people. But what we're not thinking about is the stuff below the surface, the stuff that's less visible, which is who doesn't seek power in the first place? Who does seek power? And Liz Truss is emblematic of a political class that I think is a situation where the worst among us, who are desiring power for exactly the wrong reasons, are currently most likely to get it. So that's the sort of premise of the book. I think what is really striking about modern politics is that a lot of ordinary, decent people look at the idea of becoming an MP, look at the sort of what you have to go through to become prime minister, the years and decades of personal humiliation to grovel at the feet of someone who is quite often a mediocre person themselves. And they think, no thanks, I'll do something else with my life. And I think that's the puzzle we have to crack if we're going to solve this problem over the long run, because otherwise we're just going to keep on ending up attracting the wrong leaders to power.
It's the Douglas Adams thing, isn't it? Yeah, he had the idea of Zaphod Beeblebrox as president of the universe, and this idea that anyone who wants to be president of the universe is automatically disqualified and is the wrong type of person to do it. I've certainly had conversations with people who work in and around Westminster who have been asked, would you ever like to run and be an MP? And they just look at it and go, absolutely not. But clearly, some people do, and some people want it with all their heart at the exclusion of all else, a family life or friendships and other relationships. It sort of consumes their life. So what kind of people are we getting at the moment in that kind of political system?
Yeah, so this refers to an idea called self-selection bias, which is basically that politics is comprised of people who say, yes, I want to be that person. So they put themselves forward, whereas other people don't. Now, who do you end up elevating? Well, if you're an ordinary, decent person who just wants to sort of help the community or do their bit to make society a bit better, you weigh that up on one side, the sort of altruistic, service-oriented side of things. And on the other side, you think about the money you have to raise, the donors you have to please, the constant sort of scrutiny that you're going to be under. And you end up thinking, okay, it may not be worth it. Now, if you're a power-hungry individual, and power-hungry, by the way, literally means someone who seeks power, but we use it as a negative, because of course it is, it's a situation where that power-hungry person thinks, all of this is worth it because at the end of the day, I get rich and I get money and I get power, right? And so what you've ended up doing is basically culling the people who are not motivated by money and power and rolling out the red carpet to those people who are. Now, I think that there are ways that we can make this more or less attractive depending on how we have politics operate. So I think personally, for example, about my own life and how I got interested in politics because my mom ran for the local school board when I was a kid. And she just wanted to help out the community and so on. And it wasn't well paid. There was no glory in it. She was just doing her bit. Nowadays, there are stories in the United States in particular where local school board members are getting death threats. Their kids are getting harassed because they're not abiding by the latest conspiracy theory or whatever it is, sort of in this crossfire, even at the smallest levels of power. And I asked my mom, would you run now? And she says, no, absolutely not. And you think, how many people is that true for? How many people who used to think that politics was an aspirational business of helping others have now thought, no way could you convince me to do this? And I think that is something that is a much deeper problem in society, that we have people who don't have the appetite to engage in public service. They bow out. Everybody who's self-serving bows in.
You've got this great example in the book, which I often refer to, and people don't believe me that it's true, which is about the pool of candidates and what you can expect when your pool of candidates is limited. You've got the example of a town in Alaska where is it every single police officer that they had been convicted of domestic violence?
And a felony, serious crime. So it's this town called Stebbins, Alaska. And basically they had a recruitment problem for the police. So they basically had to accept anyone who was willing to become an officer. Now, what this ended up producing was that every single officer in the uniform had been convicted of multiple crimes, including domestic violence. So if you rang up the police and your partner was abusing you, the only thing that you were guaranteed is that another abuser would come to your door. The chief of police had been convicted of 17 different crimes, and some of them extremely serious, even worse than domestic abuse. So this is a situation in which you look at this sort of town, and there's a broader lesson, which is that if you have a self-selection problem that is only producing a narrow field of the population that is power hungry and that is also simply not that deep, then you are not able to cull out the bad people and end up with the good people in charge. So recruitment is crucial to this. And I think this is also related to a broader point about power and policing in the US, in the UK, and then other countries who have figured this out, where you think about recent police scandals, whether it's in the Metropolitan Police or in the US, where in my hometown, George Floyd was murdered. I grew up in Minneapolis. And you think about why that's happening, and much of the debate is around what people in power do. And of course, that's right. We have to hold police to account. But not enough of the debate is who becomes a police officer in the first place, who looks at that job and says, I want to do that. Now, in places like the US, where the advertising, the recruitment videos used for police are basically militarized combat depictions. They roll around in tanks and they have death metal music in some of these adverts. It's not a surprise who ends up putting their application forward. So I reference in the book this example of New Zealand, where they put a lot of money, $2 million, into an ad campaign called Do You Care Enough to Be a Cop?, which depicts policing in these very funny viral videos as something around community service. And all of a sudden, the demographic profile of applicants changes, it expands, they get a huge influx of different kinds of police officers, and lo and behold, rates of violence and relations between the police and communities that used to have a much more tense relationship with police improve. So my point is that this is not rocket science. You have to think about this stuff. And too often, when we discuss bad leaders, we end the discussion after condemning them. We don't condemn the system, and the system is why we keep on ending up in this situation in the first place.
So recruitment is obviously a massive issue. There are probably more people who would like to be an MP or would like to be Prime Minister than perhaps would like to be in the police force in a town in Alaska. So you've got slightly more people doing it, although, as you said, the public scrutiny, the death threats, the kind of just the nature of the job makes it very unattractive to a lot of people who you might hope would get into politics. But even, let's say, we've got some good candidates. We've got 600 odd MPs, 350 Conservative MPs to choose from. Even within that, it feels like the 2, possibly 3 most recent leadership contests, I've lost count of how many. The one that appointed Boris Johnson, the one that appointed Liz Truss, and now the one that appointed Rishi Sunak. Tell me a bit about the structures of how, from that pool of applicants, those leaders were chosen and how potentially they could be improved. Because they didn't go to the country for them. They went to Conservative Party members.
Yeah, so this is, again, a question about structures and systems. So first off, you think about the rules the Tory party used to pick the leader. They used a very narrow, disproportionately old slice of the electorate, disproportionately white slice of the electorate, and a very small number of people. Now, I learned this lesson of how dangerous this can be the hard way because I used to work in campaign politics in the US, and you would go to these early primary events. I literally went to a chili cook-off in rural Minnesota where there were more candidates than there were attendees. And all of the attendees were insane, right? And this is from my own political party, but it was just, if you're going to spend a year and a half before the election, your time at a chili cook-off in rural Minnesota listening to policy briefs, you're an unusual person, right? And of course, political diehards are people who often provide great ideas. They're the sort of grist for the policy mill often. But they're also extremely unusual. Now, if you select leaders based off an extremist subset of the population, and I say extremist not in a sort of pejorative way, but more just that their views are extreme relative to the median, it's no surprise that you're going to get a weird decision. Liz Truss would never have been the pick of the broad electorate. I cannot fathom any world in which she would have won a contest that was put to all the voters, all adult voters in the UK. But she was able to win over a very narrow slice of the electorate that was obsessed with tax cuts. So you have to have this balance in democracy between having people have their say, but ensuring that enough people have their say that any skews in that pool are basically ironed out. The other thing that I think is important is, what are we actually selecting for when we think about who survives in this gladiator-style combat that is modern politics? The people who survive are the people who don't answer questions truthfully. They get through the 10 past 8 interview on the Today program unscathed because they don't say anything. Now, the people who answer the questions honestly and then get the gotcha sort of question, they often see their stars fall. And that's basically what the winnowing effect is at the current scale of modern politics. You have to be this sort of slippery figure who never gets pinned down, never admits mistakes, and then you can move on to the next stage, become a minister, maybe become a prime minister. So we have a selection process in which we're not selecting for people who are effective at helping people. We're selecting for people who are good at being politicians. And those are not the same thing. So I think we need to think more carefully about how we reconcile that and ensure that the system actually evaluates people on metrics that are tied to outcomes, rather than, can you be this slippery interviewee who never ends up looking like an idiot at the 10 past 8 interview on the Today program? And unfortunately, I think modern politics, to a huge degree, is really selecting for these people like Liz Truss, who calculate their entire careers to get to the top, and then are unfit for office once they actually achieve that goal.
So that's all quite negative about the UK system. But I did see on Twitter, you made a point which is quite interesting, which is, OK, Liz Truss was obviously the wrong leader in so many ways, but it took the system 44 days to get rid of her. And actually, I think it happened so quickly that we've all moved on to who the new leader is. And the British political system, for all its flaws, is able to do that. And when it became obvious that she wasn't effective, her party turned on her, as indeed they did on Boris Johnson, although we can talk a bit more about why that took so long. And you were comparing that to the US system, where it takes a bit longer?
Yeah, I have the unusual optimistic take on Liz Truss, I think, which is slightly contrarian. But basically, I fleshed this Twitter post out into a piece for The Atlantic. And what I'm arguing is that Liz Truss was an unmitigated disaster for 44 days, but she only lasted for 44 days because her own voters and her own party turned on her. And as an American living in the UK for the last 11 years, I looked at that with envy, because it's not just that Trump didn't get ousted in the 2 impeachments that he had. It's that if you look at his approval ratings, and I suggest you Google this, type in Gallup Trump approval rating, it is a flat line. It is literally a flat line. It is the most depressing chart you can imagine, because he did all sorts of crazy, horrible stuff. And his lowest approval rating in the Gallup polls, the weekly snapshot of presidential ratings, was 34% right after the Charlottesville comments, when he said very fine people on both sides about white supremacists. And the very highest he went was 49%. Now, if you accept that polling has margins of error of 3 or 4%, you're looking at basically a band of 10 points for Trump's entire 4 years. Liz Truss didn't have, I mean, this is one thing that's quite sad about her. She didn't have long enough to get a trend line. She has one snapshot. But she had an 11% approval rating in a YouGov poll that I saw.
She had a lower approval rating in the UK than Vladimir Putin, which is quite something.
Yeah. And then you compare that with, so let's look at the most recent politician who did have a trend line, Boris Johnson. April 2020, at the height of COVID lockdowns, 67% of the public approve of him. He leaves office with 23%, and his electoral victory in 2019 is about 44%, I think, of the electorate vote Tory. You have actually substantial moves, right? People are changing their minds. And if you think about what democracy requires, it requires accountability. And accountability cannot exist in such a polarized environment that even when someone objectively screws up very, very badly, I mean, 1 million Americans died in COVID because Trump told people to inject disinfectant at one point and downplayed the risks of it. It's an objective metric of catastrophic leadership. And he maintained 40% support even in that period. I look at the UK as though the Truss debacle is actually an indication that democracy is working, that when politicians fail catastrophically, there are consequences. And it's not something that I can say for the US. Now, comparing to the US in terms of democratic functioning is perhaps a low bar at the moment because we're very screwed up. And in the sweepstakes of which country is more screwed up, I was pleased that Britain took the lead for about 44 days. But I would rather have a system of chaos that gets corrected after 44 days rather than a system of far worse political leadership in Donald Trump that had basically no consequences for 4 years. And indeed, he may actually get reelected in 2024.
That's a terrifying prospect, and I hope we'll have you back on the podcast to discuss, possibly on our World Review podcast when we're looking at 2024.
Hi, it's Anoosh here. This is just a reminder that as a podcast listener, you have the option of subscribing to the New Statesman with a very special offer. You can subscribe for just £1 a week. That's 12 weeks for £12 if you go to newstatesman.com/podcast offer. We'll be right back.
From the New Statesman comes a new podcast, Audio Long Reads. The best of our reported features and essays, read aloud. Featuring writing from our authors, including Edward Docks on the death of Boris the Clown.
When did the booing start? He was never exactly sure.
A Year Inside GB News with Stuart McGurk.
One presenter told me that producers had taken to booking their own parents.
May Robson on why women's football is the more beautiful game.
Like most of the England squad, the Euro 2022 captain Leah Williamson can't afford not to have a plan B.
Ease into the weekend with our audio long reads published every Saturday morning. Just search Audio Long Reads from the New Statesman wherever you get your podcasts.
I do want to talk about Boris Johnson, though, because one thing that you have done a lot in your career is study all kinds of leaders, including dictators of sort of autocratic nations and the leaders of criminal gangs and all kinds of things that would be quite terrifying to go into those situations. And you should have gone in and asked murderous warlords, so how does being a leader of whatever gang works? Now, there were occasions during the Boris Johnson era when things happened that really shocked the political establishment. So blatant, are we allowed to say lies? I mean, they were lies, sort of blatant incorrect statements being made and not apologised for, various scandals involving individuals who clearly broke laws or protocols and were then defended, lots of questions about the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson himself, and who was paying for the refurbishment of his flat or his holidays, lots of questions about accountability and just whether the systems in the UK were strong enough to handle an individual who had no respect for those systems. And one of the things that we learn is that actually a lot of our political systems and structures are based on an unwritten constitution and kind of trends and norms. And when somebody says, do I really have to follow them? The answer is no. So as somebody who has studied some very messed up forms of leadership and government, what was your take watching that? Or did we all just overreact a little bit?
No, I don't think it was an overreaction. I think there's two major trends that I think about when I try to structure my thoughts about modern politics. One is I think the 21st century is going to be a battle between authoritarianism and democracy globally. And second, within democracies, I think there's going to be a reckoning with the fact that so much of what we take for granted in democratic functioning is not written in stone and indeed is a function of norms. And norms are not produced by ink on parchment. Norms are produced by how people interact in the political sphere. So if you are able to get away with something legally and nobody pushes back on that, that norm changes. And the next generation of political leaders then will push the envelope a little further. And I think the U.S. is the extreme case of this right now, where it's just the Republican Party has gone totally off the rails, making some of the stuff that Trump did in 2017 seem positively constrained relative to 2022. So I think that this creates even more impetus for us to get who are the leaders correct. Because I think a lot of the discussion around norms and laws and democracy has been, should we just write down everything? Should we make it so that Boris can't do this? Or should we make it so that the next leader can't do this? Yeah, okay, that may make sense in certain situations. I think it is a valid approach to deter some of these most egregious actions. But you can't anticipate every possible thing that a figure like Boris Johnson may do. And certainly in the US, there was a very ineffective response to trying to legislate against Donald Trump. So what do you do instead? Well, you have to make sure the political class is full of people who act on principle and also understand that you don't have to write down everything for it to matter, right? Things matter even if they're not written down. Now, I would say in the last several decades, that has been true in the United States and the UK, that there has actually been a reasonable level of certain things that were not written were respected, completely broken down now. And there is a sort of dual impulse that I think needs to be the response. One, write down stuff. Two, make sure you pick the right leaders because they're going to be tested. And we've seen a lot of them fail the test in recent years.
You've got a bit in your book that's about basically makes an argument almost for psychometric testing, pointing out that people who seek power, particularly in circumstances that are quite unattractive, as we've discussed, have certain traits that are quite disturbing. I think you also made the case in our interview last year that maybe we should test them, maybe we should put them on training courses, maybe the fact that you need qualification to do literally everything in this country other than be a national politician is something of an issue. Is that practical? Is there anywhere that you've seen that's doing something like that?
I think this is one of those weird aspects of modern life that we just accept because it's the way it is. And then if you take a step back and you think about it, you're like, this is very odd. Why is it that I have to go through these incessant training videos? You have to think about things like safeguarding. There's loads of actual metrics that people are judged by at the lowest levels of power. And yet when we turn over nuclear weapons to somebody, it's nothing. There's literally just an election. And an election is a performance, right? You're judging people on how well they can perform in front of the camera in little snapshots. Nobody actually really knows Boris Johnson. Nobody actually really knows Liz Truss, who's voting for them, except for close friends and family. And yet we're making judgments about what kind of person they are. Well, what does that reward? It rewards people who are very good at presenting themselves by these sort of deceptive ways. And indeed, as I talk about in the book, this is the perfect recipe for psychopaths because psychopaths are known by two words, superficial charm. And superficial charm is a very, very good thing to have on your side if you are trying to get hired in a job interview, get promoted, or indeed run in a national election. There are metrics by which you can test to see if somebody has psychopathic traits. And we do know, unfortunately, that depending on the study and the way you measure it, between 4 times and 100 times more psychopaths exist in positions of power than in the general population. So I look at that data and I think, we're not doing enough, right? We need to think more carefully about how we scrutinize leaders. They need to be subject to all sorts of testing, I also think we should ask different questions of them. So one of the favorite questions that I was asked by an interviewer when the book came out was, which question would you ask a politician? And the answer I came up with was, what would it take for you to think that you'd accomplished your goal in power and you now can retire? Because I don't think a lot of politicians think that way. I don't think they think that the reason I'm here is to achieve this goal to help other people. I think instead they think the reason I'm here is because I'm going to stay here as long as I possibly can. I think it would catch a lot of politicians off guard to say, when would you resign if you achieved a certain goal? And the rest of us think that way about a lot of the areas of our lives where we say, I've done what I set out to achieve. I'm done. Athletes do this, right? So to me, there's a broader aspect of political power that is just not examined carefully. And I think we have to consider, why do we turn over the nuclear codes to people who have no scrutiny other than putting on a great performance, being good talkers, and having no other objective qualifications to speak of.
I should say that there is an episode of Power Corrupts where you focus specifically on the possibility of nuclear warfare and how close we have come to it without realising in various points in the last couple of decades. And it is one of the most terrifying things I have ever listened to. So
I'll take that as a compliment, I guess.
Thank you for that. I just want to ask very quickly about the role that technology plays in all of this, because we're recording this just after hearing that Elon Musk is going to take over Twitter after a sort of protracted legal battle that has consumed him for months now. But that is happening. And there are people who say that social media, the way it has sped up the pace of politics, the way it has made being good on Twitter or being good in sound bites more important than the sort of long-term boring stuff, that matters. And also I've heard that the existence of WhatsApp matters, especially in terms of political parties, because you get WhatsApp groups of Tory MPs who kind of egg each other on, and then the WhatsApp messages get leaked, and then that's another form of performance. Now, we can't go back to a world with no Twitter and no Facebook and no WhatsApp, although there are quite good non-political reasons for wishing that we could. How much do you think is an issue with our political systems? And given that these technologies are out there, is there anything we can do to make their effect?
It's a great question, and it brings us full circle, I think, to the self-selection effects. Because when you think about what it means to be a politician these days, I think the US, in a lot of ways, with breakdown of democracy and some of these horrible flaws in how politics is functioning, it's a cautionary tale of what's potentially to come in the UK. And what in the US is that increasingly, especially on the right, people are running to be politicians to become social media stars. They're not running to become people who change other people's lives for the better. So what's happened with social media is it's circumvented party control. In the past, if you wanted to get on Fox News and you were a Republican congressman, you had to basically play the good member of the party for 20 years, and then maybe you'll get a primetime slot. Now you just have to say some crazy stuff on Twitter, and all of a sudden you get an invite for that night's Fox News show because you've got the edgy out there comments. You're pushing the envelope. People are responding to it because the extremists are drawn to you. So it's created an incentive to be ever more extreme and then to end up getting all the results and rewards that come with that. Because of that, there is now a shift generationally, I think, in who's becoming. It's that, I think there were people who were willing to put in the 2 decades of hard work and then hopefully it pays off because they cared about policy. I think a lot of people are now very impatient. So that's part of it. The other aspect of it, which also affects selection bias, is the scrutiny at lower levels, I should say, of politics that makes people not want to even run for low office because they are worried about a social media post that might come out from 10 years ago. And I think we have to calibrate that balance. If you're going to be prime minister, I think absolutely everything you've done is fair game. If you're going to be a local councillor, something that you may have posted on Twitter when you were 16 years old, if we go the level of scrutinizing that, we're actually going to have to weigh up how many people get deterred who otherwise might be great politicians, but said something stupid when they were 16 years old. And I think that's the aspect where we haven't really come to terms with that calibration. But I absolutely believe that social media has completely warped who's becoming a politician and how they're using political power for their own ends. And it's, as you say, the genie's out of the bottle. We're not going to fix it, put it back in. But I am very worried about the next generation who see Twitter stardom as the end rather than the means to political life.
I think if you try and find somebody to be a politician who has never posted anything stupid when they were a teenager, you're going to narrow the field even further. And what you're already seeing now is people who think they might want a political career at some point scrubbing their social media presence and being very careful about what they do and don't use. So you're basically getting people having to decide quite early on in their careers, I might want this, so I'm not going to engage in this massive thing that everyone else engages with, which is an issue in itself.
This is an issue. I remember I met someone when I was in grad school who would not go to parties, would rarely socialize, and would not really do many of the things that you do when you're a student because they were worried about how it may come back to bite them 10 or 15 years down the road if there's a photo of them having a beer during grad school. And I thought to myself, this person should not be a politician because they have not lived, right? You end up with a double-edged sword. You either end up scrutinizing so much that you end up torpedoing people who actually could make quite good politicians because they said something stupid 10 or 15 years ago. Especially, I'm not talking about like horrible racist abuse. I'm just saying stuff that's on the more minor level.
Slightly off-color jokes.
Yes, that sort of stuff. Or you end up creating a sort of new form of politician who just literally is so risk averse that they don't get the life experience that will help them make good decisions because they don't understand how people live. And both of those things are bad. So I think we have to think carefully about it.
When we talked at the end of last year, I asked whether you were in any way optimistic for the futures of democracy. And you at the time said that you were, because you had identified a whole lot of problems that are outlined in your book, but you also think there are solutions to them and there are ways that we can fix that. Now, since that time in the UK, we've had Boris Johnson's Partygate scandal that ran and ran, and the Summers leadership contest, which I think everyone, especially the Conservative Party, is really quite embarrassed about now. You've had Liz Truss crashing the economy, and now you've got Rishi Sunak. And let's not even start with what's been going on in the US during that time and the possible return of Donald Trump. Are you still optimistic that we can fix this?
Yeah, I still am. I think this is going to be a long process. I'm not optimistic in the short term. I think in the short term, Democratic decline is going to continue. But I think there is a choice that electorates make about how much backlash they want to give to politicians who screw up. And this will be one of the big tests in the next general election in the UK, whether it comes soon or when it's scheduled, because people often have short memories in politics. And the question is, do you punish a party for what they did 2 or 3 years ago? If the answer to that is yes, then I think politicians will understand that accountability still exists and democracy will create some self-adjusting, correcting mechanisms. I also think that I'm optimistic because at the end of the day, people around the world want to live in a system where they have say over the decisions that affect their lives. This is a bleak moment geopolitically where you have Vladimir Putin in Russia and Ukraine and so on. And all of these things that are happening, I don't think change that fundamental aspect of the human impulse to have a say in decisions that affect their lives. So I think democracy is going to win in the long run. It's going to be a very bumpy road to get there. And I think if we are going to get there a bit faster, a bit smoother, we have to think about power not as this static thing. Power does have some static effects. It corrupts people. But it's a system that we can design to attract or deter better or worse people from going towards power. And I think that reform debate is one I hope we have, rather than simply saying Liz Truss is useless, let's move on. You say, what system produced Liz Truss? And how can we fix it so the next time somebody like her comes along who's clearly not fit for the job, they get blocked well before they end up in office. And that is the debate that I think we need to have to fix democracies. And if we have that debate, I'm very optimistic that we can solve problems in a much more productive way going forward.
Brian Klaas, thank you so much for talking to me. You've been listening to the New Statesman podcast with me, Rachel Cunliffe, and my guest, political scientist Brian Klaas. We're produced by Hugh Smiley and Adrian Bradley, and our music is Devil with the Devil, licensed under Creative Commons. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a nice review.